Today we're looking at France teetering on the edge of political and economic chaos, a country once seen as Europe's pillar now facing questions nobody dared ask just 2 years ago. We'll examine Germany's ongoing collapse and what it means for the continent. We'll talk about Italy, yes, Italy, now mocking France's instability with what they're calling malicious joy, and we'll explore the bond market sending signals that should terrify anyone paying attention to Europe's future. But I've saved the most interesting part for the very end of this episode, so stay with me. I spent years working inside one of those big, well-known media organizations. I watched editors kill stories that didn't fit the approved narrative. I saw journalists bend facts to serve corporate interests and political agendas. Eventually, I walked away from all of that. Now I'm independent, I answer to nobody, and I tell you what's actually happening in the world, not what someone wants you to believe is happening. Before we dive in, I need to ask you something. If you find value in what we do here, if you appreciate getting news without the spin, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And if you can, consider becoming a sponsor. We put serious work into fact-checking every claim, cross-referencing sources, making sure we're not feeding you misinformation or propaganda. That takes time, effort, and resources. Your support makes it possible for us to keep doing this work without compromise. And trust me, you're going to want to watch until the very end today, because what's coming is something most people aren't talking about yet. France has always carried itself with a certain arrogance, hasn't it? A sense of exceptionalism, the Grand Republic, the birthplace of Enlightenment ideals, the cultural heart of Europe. For decades, France positioned itself as a counterweight to Germany's economic might, a stabilizing force in the European Union, a country whose institutions were supposedly unshakable. But right now, something is breaking. And the question being asked across European capitals, the question that would have seemed absurd just a couple of years ago, is this: is France becoming the new sick man of Europe? We've watched Germany's economy spiral into crisis, deindustrialization accelerating, energy costs crushing what's left of its manufacturing base. But France might be next. And here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The people asking whether France is collapsing aren't just analysts in Brussels or economists in London. They're Italians. Yes, Italy, a country famous for governments so short-lived they barely have time to hang portraits before the next coalition falls apart. Italian newspapers are now reporting on France with what they openly describe as malicious joy. Because in less than 2 years, France has cycled through 5 prime ministers. Let me say that again. 5 prime ministers in less than 2 years. The French parliament is split into 3 hostile factions after Macron's disastrous snap elections in July 2024, and they can't even pass a national budget. Think about what that means. A country that prides itself on administrative brilliance, on elite governance, can't perform the most basic function of a functioning state. And it gets worse from here. France's national debt now exceeds 3 trillion euros. 3 trillion. The cost of servicing that debt has exploded. This year alone, interest payments will hit 67 billion euros. That's more than the government spends on every department except education and defense. By the end of this decade, forecasts suggest those payments could reach 100 billion euros annually. That's not sustainable. That's a fiscal black hole swallowing everything else. In late November, the ratings agency Fitch downgraded France's debt. Their reasoning was blunt. Investors are losing faith in France's ability to stabilize its finances. Sound familiar? It should. We're seeing the same pattern in the United States, where national debt is soaring, and nobody in Washington seems capable of addressing it. The downgrade means borrowing becomes more expensive, which creates a vicious cycle. Higher interest payments mean less money for everything else, which means more borrowing, which means higher interest rates. But wait, there's more to this story that most people are missing. None of this is happening in isolation. Europe is rattled by the proxy conflict in Ukraine, a war the West fueled and funded while pretending it had no consequences. The United States under Trump is shifting its security priorities, and that's sending shockwaves through NATO. Populist movements across the EU are gaining ground, feeding on economic anxiety and resentment toward Brussels. And now France, of all countries, is being whispered about in the same breath as Greece or Italy during the Eurozone crisis. The possibility that Paris might need intervention from the IMF or the European Central Bank is no longer some fringe conspiracy theory. Economists are seriously gaming out that scenario. So how did this happen? How did a country with France's resources, its wealth, its institutional strength end up here? The answer begins in the summer of 2024, when Emmanuel Macron, frustrated by political gridlock, dissolved the National Assembly and called snap elections. He gambled that voters would strengthen his position. Instead, they delivered a parliament split into three nearly equal blocs: the centre, the left, and the right. In this three-way deadlock, nobody has the numbers to govern. Whatever one bloc proposes, the other two tear down. From that moment, France entered a spiral of political paralysis. And here's where things get really interesting. France spends more on social protection than almost any other country on earth. Around 30% of its GDP goes to social programs. It has one of the world's most generous pension systems. It subsidizes unemployment benefits, childcare, healthcare, transportation, you name it. During the pandemic, the government spent enormous sums cushioning households and businesses. When energy prices surged after the EU gleefully cut itself off from Russian energy, France spent billions more trying to shield people from the consequences. Meanwhile, taxes are already among the highest in Europe, roughly 45.6% of GDP. Raising them further is political suicide. Macron knows that. But cutting spending is equally explosive. Just suggesting tiny cuts to healthcare or transport subsidies brought taxi drivers into the streets. When Macron pushed through an increase in the retirement age from 62 to 64, the country erupted in protests that lasted months. France's political class is locked in a bitter ideological war, and economic policy is the casualty. The left demands more spending, the right rejects austerity, but also opposes tax increases. The centre can't govern without support from one of those factions, and the result is paralysis. Markets hate paralysis more than almost anything else, and right now, France is paralyzed. Before we go further, drop a comment below and let me know what you think is going to happen in France. Are they going to pull out of this, or is this the beginning of a long decline? Here's something that should alarm anyone paying attention. France now finds itself in a position arguably more dangerous than Italy's, despite Italy having a bigger debt load. Why? Because Italy has a government with a majority and a long-term plan. France has neither. Investors aren't just looking at debt levels anymore. They're looking at whether a country can make decisions, whether it has the political capacity to govern itself. And right now, France can't make decisions. Political paralysis has turned France into the weak link in the Eurozone. Bond markets now price French debt as riskier than the debt of Greece, Portugal, and Spain. Let that sink in. Those were the countries at the epicenter of the 2011 European debt crisis, the countries that France lectured about fiscal responsibility. Now France, a founding member of the EU, a nuclear power, home to one of the world's most closely watched bureaucracies, is seen as more unstable than the countries it used to look down on. But the real danger isn't just the immediate market jitters, it's what comes next. The presidential election in 2027 looms over all of this like a storm cloud. If the right or the left wins and implements even half of their spending promises, analysts warn that France could face a truly explosive moment in bond markets. We're talking about a potential meltdown, and we're only a couple of years away from finding out. The deeper danger, though, is something more subtle. It's the possibility that France enters a long period of decline, that it becomes, as one political commentator put it, paralyzed by chaos, impotence, and debt. A country with immense resources but no political capacity to use them. There are people who believe France will muddle through, that it will emerge from this crisis just fine. They point to its wealth, its infrastructure, its institutions. They argue that France is too big to fail, too central to Europe's stability to truly collapse. But others see something more ominous. They see a nation trapped by its own contradictions, too generous to cut spending, too exhausted to raise taxes, too divided to reform, too indebted to borrow, and too politically fractured to govern itself. If this trend continues, France may emerge from this decade permanently weakened, with the left, the right, and the hollowed-out centre incapable of holding the system together. A country drifting into exactly the position it once mocked. In other words, France risks becoming the new sick man of Europe, right after Germany. And if that happens, the implications for the European Union, for the Eurozone, for the entire Western alliance are staggering. Because if France can't hold itself together, what does that say about the rest of Europe? So let me bring this back together. France is facing a political and economic crisis that nobody predicted just a few years ago. 5 prime ministers in 2 years, a parliament that can't pass a budget, National debt exceeding 3 trillion euros with interest payments consuming more resources than almost any government department. Bond markets pricing French debt as riskier than countries that were bailed out during the last crisis. A political system so fractured that nobody can govern, and a population so divided that any attempt at reform triggers mass protests. This isn't just a French problem, this is a European problem. If France collapses, or even if it just weakens significantly, the entire structure of the EU becomes unstable. Germany is already spiraling. If France follows, what's left? If you found this valuable, if you want more analysis like this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you can, consider sponsoring our work. We're committed to bringing you the facts, the context, and the analysis that mainstream outlets won't touch. Your support makes that possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.